On the evening of March 22nd, 1994, a 40-year-old, very experienced airline pilot named Andrei Danilov walked into the cockpit of a huge airplane that he was about to fly out of Moscow. Once he was in the cockpit, he said hello to the two other pilots he'd be flying with that night, and then Andrei took a seat in the captain's chair. Now, this flight tonight was going to be a very routine 13-hour trip to Hong Kong, something Andrei and these other two pilots had done many times before. But this night, Andrei was totally dreading this trip, because one of the pilots he'd be flying with that night was a guy that Andrei just could not stand. His name was Yaroslav Kudrinsky, and he was going to be the relief pilot that night. So Andrei is the captain and the primary pilot. He has a co-pilot or first officer who sits right next to him, and then behind those two would be Yaroslav, the relief pilot, who basically is just there in case the captain or first officer needed a break. And so basically, Andrei was going to be forced to interact with Yaroslav all night long. And so as passengers made their way onto the plane, and as Andrei went through his pre-check procedures to get ready for this flight, Yaroslav just started yapping away about how amazing he was and what a great dad he was because he brought his kids on this flight. You know, they hadn't done a big international flight before, and so he was letting them fly with him that night. And then also Yaroslav began talking about this big surprise he had for his kids that was really going to show what an incredible father he really was. Now, Andrei and the first officer were listening to Yaroslav, but they were basically just completely ignoring him. They're not responding to him, they're not feeding into what he's saying, but Yaroslav didn't care. He just kept on rambling on and on and on about how amazing he was. And so finally, Andrei got clearance to take off. And so even though Yaroslav was totally annoying him, he was able to take off, and they went up to their cruising altitude, and they began making their way towards Hong Kong. And the whole time, Yaroslav's just going on and on and on. And finally, 5 hours into this trip, Yaroslav is still just going on and on and on. And Andrei has just had it. He cannot stand to be around this guy anymore. And so finally, Andrei turned around and just cut off Yaroslav, who was mid-sentence about some anecdote about how strong his son was and what a talented wrestler he was. And so Andrei just cuts him off and is like, Yaroslav, take over. I'm taking a break. I'm going to go sleep for a bit. And so Yaroslav would stop what he was doing. He would stand up. He would take his seat in the captain's chair, and he would take over flying the plane. And so Andrei got up. He left the cockpit. He went to the very back of the plane in the main cabin to this row of seats that was reserved for him and the other pilots. And he got in there, and he laid down, and he closed his eyes. But just a couple of minutes after closing his eyes, Andrei began to feel the plane begin to bank hard to one side. Now, Andrei couldn't really remember if this was the time they were supposed to be turning or not, but it just felt like this turn was more aggressive than anything he anticipated at any point in this journey. But Andrei knew this plane was brand new, and so if there were any kind of minor mistakes that Yaroslav was making flying the plane, well, the autopilot feature, which was state-of-the-art in this plane, would easily correct those small errors and keep the plane going towards its destination. And so, even though, again, they're still in this pretty sharp turn here, Andrei just closed his eyes again and tried to go to sleep. But a couple of minutes later, they were still banking, and in fact, the bank was starting to get even more aggressive, to the point where Andrei opened his eyes and he's thinking to himself, what is Yaroslav doing up there? Like, we're basically going in a circle at this point. We're spiraling midair. And so right as Andrei was about to get up and go see what the heck was going on, the plane began to shake really violently, and suddenly Andrei realized, oh my goodness, the plane could be stalling right now. There could be a real issue in the cockpit, and this is not some minor error. And so as passengers on the plane are starting to sense that something could be wrong here, I mean, the plane is like hard to the side and shaking, so people are starting to scream and cry, people are nervous. And so Andrei, he begins to stand up to go to the cockpit when suddenly the plane goes from just shaking and banking to basically rolling completely on its side. So all the windows are now on the ground and everybody's on their side. Andrei knew he could not go to the cockpit. There was no way to do that. And so all he could do was just hold on to his seat and pray they got out of this. And then just as quickly as all this started, it stopped. The plane kind of went back to level, it stopped shaking, and then Andrei heard the sound of the twin engines out on the wings roar as if the plane was kind of getting back up to speed, and for a second, it seemed like everything was okay. And so Andre, sensing that this was his chance to get back to the cockpit and frankly just reassume command, because whatever was going on in there, it was not okay. And so Andre, he got up and began running down the aisle to get to the cockpit. But right as he was about to grab the door, the plane suddenly tilted upward and they began rocketing up into the sky, so strong that Andre was pinned to the carpet. And so for a couple of seconds, Andre couldn't do anything, but then he began to hear the sound of the actual frame of the plane beginning to crack from all the pressure of accelerating so quickly up into the sky. And so with all of his strength, Andre reached up, he's on his hands and knees, and he grabs the door handle to the cockpit and he opens it up, and the second he looks into the cockpit, he would have known exactly what was wrong. It would turn out Yaroslav's big surprise for his kids, that he promised Andre and the first officer would demonstrate what an amazing father he was that he was going to let his kids fly the plane, just for a second. But these are untrained children that have no idea how to fly a plane. And so when Andre got up and went to go take a nap and Yaroslav took over, well, Yaroslav called up his kids who were in the main cabin, a teenage son and daughter, and they went into the cockpit and they sat down in the captain's chair and they began to fly the plane. And the daughter took the seat first in the captain's chair, and she was very careful not to touch any of the controls, even though Yaroslav was kind of encouraging her, to take the wheel and really see what it feels like. But she was nervous, and so she really didn't touch anything. But then Yaroslav's son, when he sat down in the captain's chair, he did grab the controls and he pulled on the wheel hard enough that he somehow disengaged the autopilot feature, and nobody noticed. And so as Yaroslav's son is yanking forward and backwards on the yoke, so the steering wheel of the plane began going in all these crazy directions because there was no autopilot to stop it. And by the time he had figured out what was wrong, it was too late, because the plane had entered into an unrecoverable stall and it crashed into the foothills of Siberia, killing all 75 people on board.
On the night of May 31st, 2003, 37-year-old Sandy Razzo stood behind the bar at the Green Iguana Bar and Grill, not far from the beach in Rocky Point, Florida. The summer crowds had already started arriving in waves to the area, and so the place that night was totally packed. Music was blaring, people were dancing and shouting, and the line at the bar just kept getting longer. Sandy saw a man wave her down, so she walked over to him, she leaned across the bar so she could hear his order over the music, and then she smiled. And Sandy's smile showed off her perfect teeth that seemed even whiter than they really were because of her very bronze-tanned skin. She also had long hair with blonde highlights and the body of someone who worked out all the time. And when she was younger, Sandy had worked as a fitness model, and she still had dreams of becoming a movie star someday. Because of her looks, men at the bar often made it a point to order their drinks from Sandy instead of one of the other bartenders, and the men almost always told her how pretty she was. And that night was no different. Sandy poured the man his drink and slid it across the bar to him, and right away he told her she was totally beautiful and he left her a great tip. Sandy smiled again and then moved on to the next customer. Sandy used to love all the attention she got from men at the bar, but over the last year or so, she had stopped trusting people, especially men, like she used to. So she had started to keep her guard up a little more at work. For most of her life, Sandy had always thought the best of people, and she believed that when you treated others with kindness, they would do the same to you. But that had all changed for Sandy about a year earlier, after she'd had a horrible experience with a man who she thought was one of her best friends. That man, Tracy Humphrey, had been a part-time bouncer at the last place Sandy had worked as a bartender. Tracy was this big 6'2" tall, bald guy who looked like a big weightlifter. He was actually known as Mr. Clean because he looked like the big bulky guy on the labels of Mr. Clean cleaning products. Tracy and Sandy had first bonded over their love of fitness, and when Sandy found out Tracy worked as a trainer at a gym, she had started taking classes from him. Sandy also loved that Tracy had connections to Hollywood. He claimed he'd been the stunt double for the action movie star Vin Diesel, and that he had worked as Tom Cruise's personal bodyguard. And when Sandy would tell her friends that she still dreamed of acting in movies someday, Tracy was one of the only ones who told her that her dream really could still come true. And so Sandy had hoped that she and Tracy would be friends forever, because they got along so well and he supported her dreams and she always felt relaxed and safe with him. But then, one night, when they had been hanging out at Sandy's place, Tracy had tried to pressure Sandy into having sex with him. Sandy got upset and said that was not what she wanted, and she made that clear to Tracy. But when Sandy turned him down, Tracy had gotten angry and gone into a rage. And so, soon after that incident, Sandy had left that job and started working instead at the Green Iguana, so she wouldn't have to see Tracy anymore at work. But even after she had quit, Tracy had kept calling her and bothering her. But by May of 2003, the calls had finally stopped. Sandy heard a rumor that Tracy had started dating a 20-year-old woman named Ashley, so she thought maybe that meant he would leave her alone for good. From behind the bar at the Green Iguana, Sandy could see the crowd was finally starting to thin out. Her feet were aching from standing up all night, and she was excited her shift was ending and she could finally go home. A little while later, she checked in with her manager to say she was leaving, she counted her tips for the night, and then walked through the kitchen towards the back of the building. While Sandy was getting ready to leave, people outside were making their way from one bar to the next, and music was pumping from dance clubs and from parties all across the beach nearby. But a short, bearded man wearing baggy jeans, a sweatshirt, and a baseball cap blocked out all that noise and walked straight down the sidewalk in front of the Green Iguana. The bearded man pushed his way through a crowd of people and then headed around the building to the large parking lot in back. Once the bearded man got to the parking lot, he climbed into his Volkswagen Beetle car and closed the door. Then he leaned over to the back seat and grabbed a rifle that he'd stashed there. Then the bearded man picked up a pair of old jeans on the passenger seat and slid the barrel of the rifle through one of the pant legs to conceal the barrel when he raised the gun. The bearded man lowered the passenger side window, stretched across the car, and propped the now concealed barrel of the rifle on the open window, and then watched patiently at the back door of the Green Iguana. It was hot in the car and he could feel sweat dripping down his forehead from under his hat, but he just kept on focusing on that back door. Then finally, Sandy, who had just finished her shift, came out the back door. As soon as the bearded man saw her, he raised his rifle up and aimed it right at her and fired. The bearded man heard glass break and he saw Sandy look around wildly around the parking lot. The bearded man was confused for a second, but then he realized he hadn't hit Sandy. He had missed. He'd shot the side mirror on his own car. The bearded man panicked and looked around to see if anyone had seen him. Then he tossed the rifle into the back seat, started up his car, and sped off. Back in the parking lot, Sandy got into her black BMW convertible like nothing had happened. She'd heard the glass break, and she'd heard the shot most likely, and the car speeding off, but she just kind of figured that maybe some drunk guy had smashed a bottle somewhere and then driven away. She didn't realize she had been shot at. So, inside of her car, Sandy started the engine, pulled out of the parking lot, and headed home. And after about a 25-minute drive, Sandy arrived in her quiet, well-lit neighborhood and pulled up to the 2-story townhouse she shared with her friend, Tony Ponycall. Then she parked her car in the garage and went inside. Tony got home not too long after her, and they both stayed up for a bit talking, and then eventually Sandy went up to bed and fell asleep, not realizing that earlier that night, someone had tried to kill her. The following month, Sandy spent most of her time at work or hanging out with her friends, and she was having fun and making good money, and she felt like her life was moving in a really positive direction. But as good as things were going for her, she'd started to worry a little bit about Tony, the man she lived with. It had become clear to Sandy that Tony was in love with her, and he wanted to be more than just roommates. And Sandy admitted to some of her friends that she kind of liked Tony too. He was sweet, he worked hard, and he treated Sandy like a queen. And the two of them had even gone on a few dates. But after what had happened to Sandy with Tracy, she still wasn't ready to fully trust anyone. And so Sandy had told Tony that she didn't want to have a serious relationship with him and that they were great as friends and roommates, but they should both be able to date whoever else they wanted. Tony said he understood, but there were still times he acted like they were a couple, and that concerned Sandy. On July 5th, over a month after the secret failed shooting in the parking lot, Tony and Sandy hung out for a little while at their townhouse before Sandy left for work. And when she left, Tony told her to have a great day and everything seemed good between them. And Sandy hoped Tony was finally okay with just being friends and roommates again. And when Sandy got to work, any thoughts about Tony quickly disappeared because the bar was so crowded that all she could think about was the next drink she had to make. July 4th weekend at the bar made other summer weekends look tame in comparison. and Sandy could feel her legs burning and her back aching as she made her way up and down the bar pouring drinks for what seemed like a never-ending line of customers. But even though she was tired and busy, she was still in a great mood because everyone was making a lot of money that night and all of the customers seemed like they were really having a great time. And then, after working non-stop for hours, Sandy's shift ended at about 10:30 p.m. So she counted up her tips, she said goodnight to everybody, walked through the kitchen, out the back door, and into the parking lot. And when Sandy stepped outside, she immediately heard a loud bang! And right away, Sandy was startled, but then she looked up and saw it was just fireworks exploding over the beach. Sandy smiled, climbed into her car, and headed home. And a little after 11 p.m. that night, Sandy pulled onto her street that was lined with small homes and townhouses just like hers, and she noticed how quiet everything was. She figured everybody must still be out, or they must have gone to bed early after partying the day before on July 4th. Sandy pulled into her driveway, she opened her garage door, and parked her car inside of the garage. She turned off her car's engine, pulled her keys out of the ignition, and leaned over to grab her purse on the passenger seat. But while she was leaning over, she heard something slam against the driver's side window. Sandy turned to see what had made the noise, and a look of fear came across her face. Then Sandy screamed, raised her feet up, and began kicking the driver's side door over and over and over. A few minutes after Sandy had gotten home, her roommate, Tony, flipped on the light in their kitchen. Tony was tan with short brown hair, and he was only wearing boxer shorts. He'd expected Sandy to stay out late that night, so he'd gone up to bed. But when he heard something going on in their garage, he headed back downstairs to see if Sandy had gotten home. So Tony walked across their kitchen and opened the door that led out to the garage, and he saw Sandy's black BMW parked right there. But he didn't see Sandy in the car. Tony shouted her name in case maybe she was outside out front of their property, but she didn't yell back. So Tony took a few steps into the garage towards Sandy's car. Then he leaned forward and looked in through the passenger side window, and right away his breath caught in his chest. In the car, Tony saw Sandy lying slumped over the center console, and her car seats were covered in blood. Immediately, Tony ran around to the driver's side of the car, and as he did, he felt glass pierce his bare feet, and he saw the driver's side window was shattered. Tony shook off the pain in his feet, he opened the door and climbed inside. He pulled Sandy into his arms and tried to talk to her, but she was unresponsive. Then Tony reached into Sandy's jean pocket, grabbed her cell phone, and dialed 911. The emergency operator picked up, and right away, a look of complete calm suddenly came across Tony's face. And when the operator asked him what was wrong, Tony said in a slow, steady voice that his girlfriend was bleeding in her car and he couldn't wake her up. At about 11:30 p.m., 15 minutes after Tony had made that 911 call, Detective Scott Golcheski of the Pinellas Park Police Department was sitting on the couch at his house when his cell phone rang. Ski, as everybody called Detective Golcheski, had spent a relaxing weekend celebrating the 4th of July. But as soon as he heard his phone ring late at night, he knew his relaxing weekend had just come to an end. Ski answered the phone and had a quick conversation with his boss. And a few minutes later, he was on the road heading to Sandy's townhouse. As Ski drove through the neighborhood and turned onto Sandy's street, he was a little surprised this was the call he'd gotten. On a holiday weekend, his first thought had been that maybe something had happened in the part of town where a bunch of people were drinking at the clubs and bars. But when he parked in front of Sandy's townhouse on her quiet street, he figured he was most likely dealing with a domestic dispute that had turned violent. Ski stepped out of his car and walked up Sandy's driveway. He was in his late 30s, and he was average height with broad shoulders and short brown hair. He'd lived in Florida for years, but he'd grown up in New York and had never lost his New York accent. Ski heard one of the officers who was already on the scene call out his name, so he walked towards them in the garage and saw Sandy's black BMW. Glass from the shattered driver's side window was all over the ground, and Ski saw bloody prints from someone's bare feet. And when he looked in the car, he saw the seats and floorboards were spattered with blood. The officer who had called him over told Ski that a woman in her 30s, Sandy Razzo, had been shot in her car. The victim had been rushed to the hospital, but she had been pronounced dead not long after her arrival. Ski asked who had called 911, and the officer said Sandy's boyfriend. And he also said a cop at the hospital told him that the boyfriend had followed the ambulance to the hospital in his own car before police had arrived at the townhouse. Ski made a mental note of that. There was nothing strange about a boyfriend rushing off to the hospital where his girlfriend had been shot, but police must have been very close behind the ambulance, and so he wondered if maybe the boyfriend had wanted to get away before having to face the cops. Then, a ballistics expert on the scene walked over to Ski and pointed out where they had found multiple shell casings in the car and in the garage. And Ski realized that whoever had shot Sandy made little or no effort to cover their tracks. And Ski thought that could indicate one of two things. Someone had either seen the shooter in the act, and so the shooter had panicked and ran, or the shooter had very little experience with firearms and didn't understand all the evidence a gun could leave behind. Ski wanted to test out his first theory and see if anyone had caught the shooter in the act, so he and a few other officers started going door to door in the neighborhood to ask questions. But Sandy's neighbors had either been out when the attack took place, or they had already gone to bed, and so nobody had heard or seen a thing. So after canvassing the neighborhood, Ski went back to Sandy's townhouse. He and the other officers had already been in there for hours, but he told himself he wasn't going to sleep until he was sure they had found every piece of evidence possible at the crime scene. By 6:30 a.m. on July 6th, so about 7 hours after Ski had gotten the call from his boss, Ski was still at Sandy's townhouse. He was out on the driveway, making sure they hadn't missed any tire tracks or any other evidence out there, and as he did that, he looked up and saw the sun rising, and that was when he realized how tired he was. But just then, a Toyota 4Runner vehicle pulled up in front of the townhouse, and a man stepped out of the car and started walking towards Ski, and Ski immediately felt a jolt of energy. The man introduced himself as Tony Ponycall, the victim's boyfriend. He was now wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, and he said he'd spoken to officers at the hospital and they had let him go. And so he wanted to come back home to see if he could help the police who were there. Ski was shocked at how calm Tony seemed. His girlfriend had just been shot and killed, and he showed up at the scene of the crime like he was there to just help them find a missing dog or something. But Ski knew shock affected people differently, so he didn't want to jump to conclusions. Ski asked Tony if they could go inside and talk through the events of the previous evening. Tony smiled and said he'd be happy to help. And as they walked across the yard towards the front door, Ski noticed there were scratches on Tony's hands and arms. Once they were inside, Tony led Ski through a foyer with peach-colored tile floors and into a living room with a high ceiling. Tony sat down on the couch, and Ski sat in a chair across from him. Police had found no evidence of forced entry in the house, and Tony said nobody other than him had come into the house that night. Then, with an almost blank look on his face, Tony said he'd been in the upstairs bedroom when he heard something going on in the garage, so he went downstairs to see if maybe Sandy had gotten home, and he told Ski about how he had found Sandy slumped over in her car. But even when talking about the moment he had found Sandy with blood all over her face and clothes and all over the car, Tony remained completely calm. So, Ski leaned in a bit closer and asked Tony if he and Sandy's relationship was serious or more like casual dating. And Tony said Sandy was actually his fiancée. A confused look came across Ski's face, and he pointed out that Tony had just introduced himself as Sandy's boyfriend. But Tony quickly said that he just hadn't gotten used to being engaged yet. Ski nodded, but watched Tony's face closely to see if he looked like he might be lying, but Tony's appearance never changed. So, Ski pointed at Tony's hands and arms and asked him how he'd gotten all those cuts. Tony said when he climbed into the car to try to revive Sandy, he'd cut his arms and his hands on the shattered glass. And he also said he had not been wearing shoes or socks at the time, and he'd cut his bare feet as well on the glass on the ground. And when he said this, Ski figured that probably cleared up who those bloody footprints belonged to. Then finally, Ski looked Tony in the eye and asked him if he could think of anyone who might want to harm or kill Sandy. And for the first time, Tony's calm, cool demeanor disappeared. His face started to turn red, he clenched his jaw, and then he said there was one person who definitely could have killed Sandy. And that guy was a guy they called Mr. Clean, Tracy Humphrey. In his time as a detective, Ski had tried to stick to a simple rule: never get tunnel vision when working a case. Over the years, he'd seen a lot of cops build cases entirely around one suspect, and when that suspect turned out to be innocent, the cases just fell apart. So, in the days following Sandy's murder, Ski still definitely considered Tony to be a major suspect. Tony was the one who had found Sandy and called 911, and he had those scratches on his hands and arms. And on the day after the murder, Ski had heard from one of Sandy's co-workers at the Green Iguana that Sandy had never agreed to marry Tony, and she'd actually told him she didn't want a serious relationship with him at all. So Tony calling Sandy his fiancée just seemed totally strange to Ski. But Tony had undergone a gunpowder residue test to determine if he'd recently fired a gun, he had willingly submitted DNA samples, and he had allowed the forensics team to do a thorough investigation of his car. And so, while the investigators waited for all those test results to come back, Ski started looking into other possible suspects. And someone who worked at the Green Iguana had seen a bearded man kind of lurking outside the night Sandy was killed, but they had no idea who he was. So Ski now had Tony and this unknown bearded guy as possible suspects, but for the time, he wanted to turn his attention to Tracy Humphrey, aka Mr. Clean, the man who Tony was so sure could be Sandy's killer. So at 3 p.m. on July 8th, less than 3 days after Sandy's murder, Ski paid a visit to the gym where Tracy worked as an instructor and personal trainer. Ski walked into the gym and heard the sound of trainers shouting encouragement and people grunting while they lifted weights. Then he walked up to the front desk, showed the man behind the counter his badge, and asked to speak with Tracy. The employee said he would go get Tracy and pointed Ski to a small office where he could have some privacy. Ski thanked the man and then walked into the office, took a seat at a table with nothing on it, and waited. And a couple of minutes later, Tracy walked in. He was 36 years old, out of breath, dripping with sweat, and had a towel wrapped around his neck. Ski was taken aback by how big and intimidating this guy was. Ski asked Tracy to close the door behind him and have a seat. So Tracy closed the door, he wiped the sweat from his face with his towel, and then he sat down. Then he introduced himself to Ski in a low, soft voice. And right away, Ski thought that Tracy's voice didn't really match his body. Ski smiled and said he knew Tracy was working, so he wouldn't take up much of his time. Then he asked if Tracy had heard about what happened to his friend Sandy. Tracy said he'd read about it in the newspaper and that he was totally heartbroken. Ski told Tracy that he was very sorry for his loss because Ski believed that it was always a good idea to start a line of questioning by empathizing. But before Ski could actually ask a follow-up question, Tracy suddenly stood up and said he did not feel comfortable talking to police at work, and that if Ski had a problem with that, he could contact Tracy's lawyer. Ski was surprised the conversation had taken such a quick turn, and it definitely made him question why Tracy wanted to get out of there so fast. But he didn't have anything to charge Tracy with, so he just thanked Tracy for his time, stepped out of the office, and walked back through the gym. And when Ski stepped outside, right away he felt the sun on his face and a warm breeze blowing. The temperature was about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and Ski thought that this was the perfect kind of summer day to go to the beach. And right there, it struck him that Sandy would never get to enjoy these perfect summer days in Florida ever again because someone had robbed her of her future. And that made Ski very angry. He wanted to find Sandy's killer as fast as he could. And the conversation he just had inside the gym made him want to dig a lot deeper into Tracy's life. Over the following week, Ski and the investigative team returned to Sandy's townhouse multiple times to see if any new evidence had emerged. And they also followed up with Sandy's co-workers to see if they remembered something from the night of Sandy's murder that they might have overlooked the first time they were interviewed. But nothing new surfaced. So during that time, Ski also did something that some other detectives might not have done. Ski's father had been a fireman, and so Ski had always admired firefighters and had close relationships with a lot of them in the area. And so he reached out to friends at different local fire departments, filled them in on the Sandy Rozzo case, and asked them to please let him know if they had anything that might help him find Sandy's killer and bring them to justice. Ski didn't know if anything would come of asking these firemen for help, but it just made sense to him to use all the resources at his disposal. But as the days passed, no new evidence came in from anywhere, and so Ski started to really get frustrated. And he wanted to move the investigation forward, but he'd run into a big problem. Tracy's lawyer had told Tracy not to say another word to police about Sandy's murder. And that was a major roadblock for Ski, because even if Tracy hadn't killed Sandy, the police couldn't rule him out if they didn't get any information from him. But Ski refused to let this lawyer bring his investigation to a stop, so he came up with a plan to work around Tracy. Ski had learned that Tracy recently married a 20-year-old woman named Ashley who worked with him at the gym. So he figured if he couldn't talk to Tracy, maybe he could talk to Tracy's new wife. But Ski wanted to make sure Ashley was alone when he met with her, because if Tracy was there, Ashley almost certainly would be told not to talk. So at around 3 p.m. on July 16th, 11 days after Sandy's murder, Ski drove to the gym where Tracy and Ashley worked and parked right outside. Then he stepped out of his car and walked right up to the large windows out front and pressed his face up to the glass to look inside. But he couldn't see if Tracy or Ashley were in the gym or not. So Ski went inside, walked up to the employee he'd met there the last time, and asked if Tracy was working. The man said he was, but that he'd just started teaching a class. So Ski asked if Ashley was working, and the man said no, she had the day off. And that was all Ski needed to hear. He turned around, rushed out of the gym, and ran to his car. He knew he was in a race now. As soon as Tracy finished his class and found out a cop had been looking for him and Ashley, Tracy would call his wife to tell her not to talk. So Ski got in his car, started the engine, peeled out, and sped off down the street. And about 10 minutes later, after speeding across town, Ski hit the brakes and parked his car in front of the apartment building where Tracy and Ashley lived. He took a deep breath, calmed himself down, and then got out of the car and walked to their apartment. After knocking on the door opened, and it was Ashley. Ashley was pretty with long brown curly hair and big eyes, and she was wearing shorts and a t-shirt. Ski showed her his badge and asked if he could come inside and talk for a bit. Ashley shifted back and forth on her feet, and she had a nervous look on her face, but she said okay. Ashley closed the door behind them and then led Ski to their living room. Ashley walked around a wooden coffee table and sat down on the couch, and Ski took a seat in a nearby chair. Once they were seated, Ski asked her how long she'd been married to Tracy, and Ashley said they'd actually just gotten married on July 4th at the gym where they worked. Ski smiled and said it must have been nice to have a wedding on a holiday with fireworks going off all night. Then Ski asked her if she and her new husband had gone on a honeymoon right after their wedding. But Ashley laughed and said the following night, July 5th, they just rented some movies, ordered pizza, and just hung out on the couch. Ashley shifted her position on the couch and asked what this was all about. But Ski just kept on smiling and asked where they had rented the movies and gotten pizza from. And Ashley gave him the name of the video store and the pizza place. Then Ashley's cell phone, which was sitting on the coffee table, started to ring. She sat up straight and looked at the phone and then asked Ski if she could answer it, and Ski said, of course, it was her phone. So Ashley grabbed the phone, walked into the kitchen, and answered the call. And when Ski heard her talking from the other room, he knew it was Tracy on the other line and that getting any more information out of Ashley was going to be impossible. But Ski kept on smiling because he'd gotten what he'd came for. Ashley had just given Tracy an alibi for the night of the murder, and now Ski just had to follow up on it. So after Ashley hung up and came back into the living room, Ski immediately just thanked her for her help and then walked outside to his car. And not long after that, he drove to the video store that Ashley had mentioned. And an employee there pulled up Tracy's rental history and showed Ski that Tracy had indeed rented movies a few hours before Sandy had been murdered. After that, Ski drove to the pizza place that Ashley said they'd ordered from, and one of the pizza delivery drivers there pulled up their records on their computer, and the records showed that Tracy had ordered pizza less than an hour before Sandy's murder. And then the delivery driver told Ski that he remembered delivering that pizza to a tall, big, bald guy a little after 11 p.m. on July 5th, almost the exact time Sandy had been killed. Ski thanked the pizza delivery guy and then went back outside, got into his car, and headed for the police station. And as he drove, he felt like even though this was great information, it was like he had hit a big dead end. Tracy's simple alibi, that he was at home eating pizza, looked like it was the truth. And so Ski wondered if maybe he needed to take his focus off of Tracy for a while and turn it back to Sandy's roommate, Tony. But then, on the following day, Ski got a call from one of the people he'd spoken to at the Tampa Fire Department, and they said they'd found something in an arson case of theirs that they thought might be connected to Sandy's murder. And what the fire department told Ski would put his investigation right back on track. and it would lead him directly to the bearded man who had tried to shoot Sandy in the Green Iguana parking lot. Based on the report that Ski received from the fire department, evidence found at the crime scene, and information gathered throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Sandy on July 5, 2003. A little after 10:30 p.m. on July 5th, Sandy's killer had fallen asleep in a compact rental car in the Green Iguana parking lot. The killer was wearing a baseball cap pulled down low just above their eyes, and the thick sweatshirt and pants they were wearing had caused them to get so hot inside of the car that they dozed off for a few minutes. But then the sound of a car door slamming nearby had woken them up. They looked out the windshield and saw Sandy driving off in her black BMW. The killer immediately sat up straight and yelled out in frustration and then slammed their hands down on the steering wheel. The killer had intended to shoot Sandy right there in the parking lot, but now that wasn't an option. So the killer glanced over and looked at their Ruger .22 caliber pistol on the passenger seat, and then they started the car and pulled out onto the street behind Sandy's BMW. The killer still felt a little out of it from having fallen asleep, and their hands were sweaty on the steering wheel, but they managed to weave their way through holiday weekend traffic and keep up with Sandy's car. Then, after about 25 minutes, the killer followed Sandy as she turned off a main road into her neighborhood. The killer eased off the gas to make sure they didn't get too close to Sandy's car. The killer saw Sandy pull into her driveway, open the garage door, and park her BMW inside of the garage. So the killer pulled the rental car right up to the curb in front of Sandy's townhouse. Then, with their heart pounding in anticipation, the killer wiped the sweat from their eyes, they grabbed the pistol off the passenger seat, opened the car door, and ran up the driveway into the garage. Once the killer was inside, they saw Sandy leaning over the passenger seat to grab her purse. So the killer ran up to the driver's side, raised the pistol, and slammed the butt of it into the window and held their hand up to shield their eyes from the glass. But they didn't break the window. Instead, the killer looked down and saw the glass intact, and inside the vehicle, Sandy had heard the sound, whipped herself around, and was looking up at them with a look of fear and confusion on her face. Then Sandy began screaming, and she raised her foot and began kicking the driver's side door over and over again, trying to open it to maybe slam into the killer. But the door didn't open, and Sandy just kept on kicking. Meanwhile, the killer could feel every muscle in their body start to tense up, and more sweat dripped down their face and neck, and their chest started to feel tight, and in a panic, the killer just raised their gun right up to the window and fired into the car. The window shattered and glass flew at the killer, but they kept on firing over and over again until they had unloaded all 8 rounds into the car. Inside the BMW, Sandy was bleeding from her torso, her foot, her head. Blood covered her face and clothes and was spattered on the car seats and floorboards. She was choking, her vision was fading, and she was struggling to breathe. Then everything went black, and Sandy slumped over the center console. After looking inside the car and making sure Sandy was motionless, the killer turned and ran out of the garage, back down the driveway, got into their rental car, and once inside, they took a deep breath and put the pistol back on the passenger seat, right next to the fake beard they had been wearing earlier that night. It would turn out the short, bearded man who had failed to kill Sandy in May when they had fired at her coming out of the bar and missed, and then had successfully killed Sandy on July 5th, was really a woman in disguise. It was Ashley Humphrey, Tracy's new wife. And on both occasions, Ashley had disguised herself as a man by wearing baggy jeans, a big sweatshirt, a baseball cap pulled down low, and a cheap fake beard. And she had made a point to be seen looking like a man by other people outside the Green Iguana, which is why she was kind of lurking around. She wanted to be seen. But on the night of the actual murder, Ashley, who had been wearing the beard, had been sweating so much that she had removed it when she'd actually gone inside the garage to kill Sandy. And it was the call from the Tampa Fire Department that actually led Ski back to Ashley almost right after he had thought about moving on from her and her husband. On the night of Ashley's failed murder attempt on Sandy back in May, she had accidentally shot her own car's side mirror, and Ashley had worried that the bullet hole in her mirror would eventually attract police attention. So, in a total panic, Ashley had driven her Volkswagen Beetle with the shot-up side view mirror to a vacant lot and then set it on fire. And when the fire department investigated what they believed was a case of arson, they had traced the burned Volkswagen back to Ashley. And then when they had talked to Ski about this, they realized that Ashley was in a relationship with Tracy Humphrey, who was one of Ski's major suspects. And so, Ashley was ultimately arrested, and she confessed to killing Sandy. But the case didn't end there. Leading up to Ashley's trial, she cooperated with police, and she said Tracy had threatened her with violence in order to force her to murder Sandy. And she said Tracy had even made her marry him the night before the murder because spouses cannot be forced to testify against each other in court. And it would turn out that Tracy had a clear motive for wanting to kill Sandy, because the fight he had had with Sandy when she refused to have sex with him had actually been far worse than most of Sandy's friends knew. On that night, after Tracy had flown into a rage, he had beaten Sandy and raped her. And eventually, Sandy had filed charges against Tracy, and his trial was set to start in August of 2003. So, he had gotten Ashley to kill Sandy so the state wouldn't have a witness to prove the allegations against him, and the trial would just go away. Despite Tony Ponycall's odd decision to call Sandy his girlfriend and then also his fiancée when talking to police, along with his weirdly calm behavior in the immediate aftermath of Sandy's murder, he was not actually in any way connected to her death. Ashley was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison and is scheduled for release in 2028. As for Tracy, in the lead-up to his murder trial, several women stepped forward and shared their own stories about how he had also abused them. Tracy was ultimately convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison.
In October of 1994, a middle-aged man named Ivan, who lived in Estonia, which is a country in Northern Europe, was walking in this forest looking for firewood. This forest butted up against the town he lived in, which was called Timiku, and so as a result of his proximity to it, he had spent a lot of time in these woods over the years. But in general, his exposure to this forest was just on the fringes. He would only look for firewood along the perimeter of the woods. But for whatever reason, that day he was just really having a hard time finding good firewood, and so at some point he decided to just walk deeper into the woods to see if he would have luck in there. And so he turns and starts walking into the forest, and very quickly, when the town has kind of disappeared from view behind him, he looked around and kind of liked being in the woods. He didn't go for walks in the woods, and suddenly he was on this nice nature walk. And so he decided, you know what, I can wait on the firewood. I'll just walk in the forest for a little while longer and enjoy myself and kind of meditate. So he just continued walking deeper and deeper into the woods. And after walking for nearly an hour, just kind of mindlessly walking about, he sees up ahead there is very clearly a clearing, and then before the clearing is what looks like a chain link fence. Now, he's never been this deep into the woods before, so he has no idea what this is, but he's obviously curious, and so he decides he'll go see what it is. And so he continues walking closer and closer to what obviously is a chain link fence, and as he's getting closer to it, the trees around him are beginning to thin out, and suddenly, before he even reaches the fence, he gets a very clear view of what's on the other side. And it's this huge multi-story building that almost looks like a factory or some sort of government facility, and it's sitting maybe a couple 100 feet away from the fence, right in the middle of this property, and there's really nothing around it. It's just this cleared out big open area with this big building right in the middle, and there's a fence all the way around it. And so Ivan is totally intrigued by this, and so he walks right up to the fence, he grabs onto it, and he tries to look and figure out what this building is, but there's no clear signage on it, and there's no people anywhere. It's completely barren. There's nothing but this building. And then he notices there's obviously graffiti on the sides of this building, and the doors and windows appeared to be boarded up. And so this building, whatever it is clearly abandoned. And the first thought that goes through Ivan's head is scrap metal. Times were tough for Ivan and his family, and so he and his two brothers, they all lived together, they would go out and they would steal scrap metal and sell it for a little bit of extra cash to make ends meet and provide for their big family. And so he's looking at this big building thinking, you know, if I can get in there, I guarantee you there is some metal that I can steal and I can sell. And so Ivan stayed at this fence, just kind of staring at this building for a little while longer, and continued to look around to make sure there weren't any people that he hadn't seen before. And after feeling satisfied that this really was a totally abandoned building, he turned around and began hustling back towards town. And when he finally made it to town, making sure to grab some firewood along the way, he rounded up his two brothers and he told them about this find in the forest. And they all very excitedly agreed that that night they would go right back out there and they would go inside the building and see what they could find. And so around 9 p.m. that night, the brothers met up and they had flashlights and a set of bolt cutters, and they headed into the nearby forest and they marched their way all the way up to this fence that Ivan had found earlier in the day. And they lifted their flashlights up and they scanned through the fence all over the property. And when they didn't see anyone, they put their flashlights down and one by one, they climbed up and over this fence. And then once they were all on the other side, they began making their way up to this huge building sitting in the middle of the property. And when they got up to this building, they confirmed it definitely looked like it was abandoned, except all of the doors and windows were sealed in such a way that even with bolt cutters, there was just no way to pry them open. They were not going to get inside this building. And so after a little while of still trying to kind of smash their way into this building, the brothers all linked up and they decided, you know what, we're not getting in, and the longer we stay here, the better the chances are that we get caught. And so let's just head back. And so feeling totally dejected, they turn and they start walking back towards the fence they hopped in on. And as they're walking along, they're kind of shining their lights left and right and looking around. And off to the far right side of the property, there is this small shack that they had not noticed on their way in. And so the brothers look at each other and they're like, hey, you know, we're already on this side of the fence. We might as well go check it out and see what's inside of it. Maybe there's scrap metal in there. And so the brothers turn and start making their way over to the shed. And when they get there, they discover it's only secured with a simple padlock on a wooden door. And so they get their bolt cutters, they pop off the lock, they open up the door, and there's initially nothing inside. At least that's what they think. But they move something on the ground and it reveals this stairwell that leads into this underground bunker. And now it's the middle of the night on this abandoned property they've snuck into, and so there's some apprehension, but they shine their lights down the steps and they didn't see any immediate hazards. And they're thinking, you know what, this is an adventure. Let's go down and see what's down there. And so they all went down the steps, and when they got down to the bottom, they turned the corner and they shined their light to see what's down here. And what was down there was this huge cellar that was full of scrap metal. There was metal all over the ground, and then there were also these shelves that went as far back as their lights could shine. And on the lower shelves, there were these weird square metal boxes that almost looked like briefcases. And then above those, on the top shelf, were 55-gallon aluminum drums. And in the brothers' experience, these drums were very, very valuable. Except they needed to make sure they weren't full of some liquid, because if they're full, they weigh like 500 pounds, and there's no way they'd be able to get them out. And then trying to open them up and spill whatever's inside of them is hazardous for a lot of reasons. And so they walked over to the first 55-gallon drum they saw, and they pushed it to see if it was empty. And the drum immediately rocked back and forth, echoing inside, indicating that it was empty. This was a huge, huge win. And so the brothers are totally amazed. They grab this first drum, they pull it off the shelf, and they wheel it over to the base of the steps. And then they go back to get another drum off the shelf, and they reach up, they grab another empty drum, and as they're pulling it off, it dislodges another 55-gallon drum that was nearby that was full of some liquid, so it weighed 500 pounds. And it comes crashing off the shelf and it lands on Ivan's leg, pinning him to the ground. And immediately the two other brothers pulled the drum off of Ivan, but it was obvious there had been significant damage done to his leg. Ivan couldn't even stand up anymore. And so the brothers are looking around thinking, man, this is an amazing haul, but if Ivan can't even walk, I mean, it's going to be a nightmare trying to haul this metal back while also supporting Ivan. And so they decided they would leave now and they would wait for Ivan to heal up, and then they would come back and they would collect their amazing haul. And so the brothers, they reached down and they picked up whatever pieces of metal they could to just kind of stuff in their pockets. And then the two brothers supported Ivan and carried him up the stairs. And then they very slowly walked their way over to the fence. And then somehow the three of them got up and over the fence. And then very slowly they made their way all the way through the forest back to Tamiku. And when they got there, the two brothers helped Ivan get into his house and they put him in his bed. and then Ivan went to sleep. The next morning, when Ivan got up, he was expecting to feel better, but in fact, his leg felt exponentially worse. And then over the course of the next 72 hours, Ivan still believed if he just gutted it out and he waited, his leg would get better. But it just got worse and worse and worse. And so 4 days after this leg injury, Ivan was in so much pain, he couldn't do anything. And so he finally decided he had to go to the hospital. And so when he gets to the hospital, the doctor asks Ivan, what happened to your leg? And Ivan would tell him that, I was in the woods and a tree fell on my leg, because he didn't want to admit to trying to steal scrap metal. And so the doctors, they accepted this. It seemed totally reasonable based on what his injury looked like. And so they admitted him to the hospital. They put him in his hospital room. And right away, the doctors and nurses began administering all the treatments and things they would do for a crush injury. But it seemed like nothing was working. Over the course of the next several days, Ivan complained endlessly of the pain in his leg getting worse and worse and worse, and the swelling was going up, and overall, Ivan's health just continued to deteriorate over his stay in the hospital. And then, a week after being admitted to the hospital, so roughly 10 or 11 days after he was hurt, the doctors walked into his room, and he was dead. His kidneys had just abruptly failed, and the doctors and nurses had absolutely no idea why. And so they told the family, we don't know what happened to him. And so the family just had to collect Ivan's body, and then they had a funeral for him. But they're all thinking to themselves, how could this have happened? He hurt his leg and then his kidneys failed? It didn't make any sense. But before they could get any clarity on that, they were dealt another tragedy. The beloved family dog just kind of abruptly died. It was young, it was healthy, and so just like Ivan, it was like this totally unexpected death. And so once again, the family's asking, what's going on here? And then just a couple of days after that, Ivan's stepson came downstairs one morning complaining of feeling sick. And when his family looked at his hands, they were blistered and covered in boils and looked like he had just reached his hands into a fire or something. But he would tell his family, I didn't do that. I don't know what's going on with my hands. I don't know why I feel so sick. And so the family rushed the boy to the hospital, and naturally the doctors asked him, how did your hands get this way? What happened to you? And the boy would say, I don't know. But over the course of this initial discussion with doctors, the boy would tell them that over the last couple of days, he had been sifting through his stepfather, Ivan's possessions, and he had actually been using some of Ivan's tools from his toolbox. Now, the doctors were already aware of the strangeness around Ivan's death, and they were aware of the sudden passing of the family dog, and now they're seeing this boy who is showing up with these strange symptoms for no particular reason, and so the doctors knew something was off. And so on a hunch, they contacted the authorities, and they told them what they thought. And then later that day, the authorities showed up at Ivan's family's house, and when they got out of the car, they were covered head to toe in white hazardous materials suits. And they told the family to evacuate the house for their safety. And then these people in suits got out these special wands and tools, and they marched into the family home, and immediately all their equipment led them to this one particular closet near the kitchen. And when they opened it up, in the closet was Ivan's toolbox, the same one the boy had been handling over the past couple of days. And when they opened that up, they found there were lots of normal tools you would expect inside of a toolbox. And they discovered one strange piece of scrap metal. It was the only piece of scrap metal that Ivan had grabbed off the floor of that cellar and tucked in his pocket before he and his brothers had left. And then after Ivan had passed away, his stepson had been going through his things, and he had discovered this piece of scrap metal, and for whatever reason, he had transferred it from the jacket to Ivan's toolbox. What Ivan and his family didn't know was that that piece of metal was extremely dangerous, because it came not from some abandoned building on some abandoned property in the middle of the forest. It came from an abandoned nuclear waste storage facility. That is what Ivan and his brothers had snuck onto. But because Ivan and his brothers had hopped over that side fence, they didn't see any of the warning signs that are posted on the front of the front gates telling people to stay back. Inside that cellar that the brothers were in, those small metal briefcase-looking things on the lower shelves were shields for radiation. Inside of each of them was radioactive metal.
And when that full 55-gallon drum came crashing off the shelf and smashed into Ivan's leg, his leg was not the only thing it smashed into. It smashed into one of those metal briefcases and broke it open, sending the radioactive metal inside of it flying out, and it landed right next to Ivan on the ground. And so when the brothers scrambled to pick up whatever loose scrap metal there was on the ground, Ivan unfortunately grabbed one piece, and it was the radioactive one. By the time Ivan finally got back to his house, he was actually already dead. He just didn't know it yet. That piece of metal had been inside of his jacket pocket, and it had been pressed against his body long enough that he had been dealt a fatal dose of radiation. There was nothing anybody could have done, even if they knew what had happened to him. As for the dog, it used to sleep on Ivan's jacket, and it did so when this piece of scrap metal was inside of it, and so it too died of radiation poisoning. As for Ivan's stepson, the reason his hands had been so badly burned and why he'd become so sick, that was just from his brief exchange of touching the piece of scrap metal and then putting it in Ivan's toolbox. That alone had done that much damage to him. When the doctors considered the strangeness of Ivan's death, the dog's death, and now this boy's symptoms, they did suspect radiation poisoning, and so that was how the authorities were able to get to their house and very quickly locate that toolbox. Amazingly, Ivan's stepson and the rest of Ivan's family, including his two brothers, would make full recoveries. However, several months after this event, and after authorities had come in and said their house was clear of radiation, the grandmother would suddenly die, totally unexpectedly. She was healthy, nothing was wrong with her. And so even though it was not officially cited as having been caused by radiation, many people believe it's from the exposure she had to this piece of scrap metal. Our next story is called Long Lost Daughter. In 2007, 60-year-old Michael Dick was living in Bow, East London with his wife and two daughters. While his life was not exactly exciting, it was good. He lived in a quiet and safe neighborhood, and Michael, who used to be a carpenter, was now semi-retired and got to spend the bulk of his time with his friends and family. But that year, something really started to bother him. 10 years prior, Michael had split up with his first wife, and after their divorce was finalized, his ex-wife and the daughter they had together, her name was Lisa and she was 21 at the time, those two stayed in the family home in Sudbury, England, and Michael moved south about an hour and a half to Bow, East London. The divorce had been quite messy, and so Michael had not only lost touch with his ex-wife, he had also lost touch with Lisa. And so fast forward 10 years back to 2007, and Michael and Lisa had not spoken since the divorce, and Michael found himself suddenly feeling this unbelievable wave of grief over the loss of his relationship with his first child. And so after speaking with his current wife and his two other daughters, he decided that he had to go find Lisa. He had to be reunited with her. The only problem was he didn't know where Lisa lived, he didn't have her contact information, and he didn't know where his ex-wife was, so he couldn't even ask her how to get in touch with Lisa. However, he did have the street address of where they used to live in Sudbury, England, and so he decided that would be his starting point. So in August of that year, Michael and his two other younger daughters, they hopped in the car and they left Bow, East London, and they headed up to Sudbury. And when they got there, Michael navigated to his old street, which had brick houses lining each side of the road, and he drove down until he spotted his old house, and he parked right out front. And then he alone hopped out of the car and he walked up to the front door. He took a deep breath and then he knocked on the door. When the door opened, it was not Lisa, it was not his ex-wife, it was some other family that he didn't know, and they didn't know Lisa or his ex-wife, and so they said, good luck finding your daughter, but we don't have any information for you. And so Michael was crushed, but he thanked them, and he turned around, and he went back to the car, and he told his other daughters about what he had just learned, and then from there, the trio just kind of began driving around Sudbury, half looking for Lisa out on the streets.
although none of them thought they would actually find her, and then also kind of discussing what they were going to do next, because now they had nothing. And so as they're driving around the streets of Sudbury, they come to the realization that their best bet at finding Lisa is putting some sort of story in the local newspaper that hopefully she would see, and then she would contact Michael. And so they drove to the headquarters of the local paper, the Suffolk Free Press, and they went inside and they managed to speak to a reporter. And after telling the reporter Michael's story about how he's lost touch with Lisa, the reporter thought, you know what, this is actually a pretty interesting story and I'd be happy to do a small feature on you guys. And so the reporter, along with a photographer, brought Michael and his two daughters outside. They took a picture of them, and then they told Michael, in the next edition of the paper that will run in a couple of days, we'll run this picture along with a little write-up about how you're looking for Lisa, and we'll put your contact information in there, and hopefully she sees it and she reaches out to you and you can be reunited and live happily ever after. And so Michael thanked the reporter and the photographer, and then he and his other two daughters hopped in the car and headed back to Bow, East London. In 2007, at the same time that Michael was beginning his search for Lisa, Lisa was actually beginning to think, you know what, I want to go find my dad. Lisa was now 31 years old. She had 3 kids of her own. She was married. She had moved out of Sudbury to a neighboring town. And she was thinking, I really want to have a relationship with my dad again so that my kids can have a relationship with him. And so she began speaking with her mother and with friends about how she should go about finding her dad, because like Michael, she didn't have his contact information. She didn't have a phone number. She didn't know anyone who would. And then when she went on social media to look for him, he wasn't on there. And so she was kind of at a loss. Then one day in August, she was at her office and she was in the break room and she saw a copy of the Suffolk Free Press sitting out on the coffee table. So she picked it up and she began flipping through the pages. And then suddenly she stopped when she saw a picture of herself. She saw her and her mother walking along the streets of Sudbury. She had been in Sudbury just a couple of days ago to talk to her mom about finding her dad and kind of strategies for how to go about doing that. And then Lisa glanced at the caption for this photo and she nearly fell off of her chair. The man and the 2 girls who were the main focus of this photo that Lisa was in were her father and her 2 stepsisters. She just didn't recognize them. She just saw herself in the back of this photo. So purely by chance, after being apart for over a decade, on the only day that Lisa happened to be in Sudbury talking to her mom about finding her father, she was literally 100 feet behind her father and her stepsisters as they were looking for her and putting out this ad in the paper to hopefully find her. And this one photo that the photographer took captured all of them in the same frame. Lisa would, of course, read the article and get her father's contact information. She would reach out, and initially Michael actually thought it was a scam and didn't believe this was actually Lisa calling to say, I found myself in the picture of you in Sudbury. But eventually he was convinced and he drove right out to Sudbury and he got a chance to meet his grandkids for the first time. And today, he and Lisa are still in touch.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Sparks Fly.
In July of 1848, a 25-year-old man named Phineas Gage got a job working construction on the Hudson River Railroad in New York. At this time in America, railroads were being laid all over the country, and so lots of workers like Phineas were needed to blast rock out of the way to lay down these railroad tracks. And as it happened, Phineas was an expert in explosives. He had learned how to set controlled blasts growing up on his family's farm in New Hampshire, and then later in his life, he had worked in a mine blasting through rock. And so in addition to just being the ideal railroad worker for this time in America, when Phineas actually started working in New York on this railroad, his coworkers immediately started looking up to him. Phineas was extremely smart and energetic. He was this incredible conversationalist. He was charismatic and funny and a natural leader. And so just 2 months into starting this new job, it was no surprise to anyone who knew Phineas or worked with Phineas that he was promoted to blasting foreman, which meant Phineas would lead the explosives team. Phineas was so excited about this promotion that he went to a blacksmith and had a custom tamping iron made. A tamping iron is a long metal rod that's used to pack explosives. When railroad workers wanted to blast through, let's say, a big rock, they would start by drilling a deep but skinny hole in the rock. Then they would pour blasting powder inside, then they'd put a fuse inside, and then using this tamping iron, they would push the blasting powder and the fuse deep into this hole inside of this rock or whatever it was they were blowing up. And then once it was packed, they would ignite it. Usually, tamping irons were sort of rough tools that looked like crowbars, but Phineas really wanted something special to commemorate this promotion. And so Phineas had the blacksmith make this perfectly straight, smooth, 4-foot-long metal tamping iron, and on one end was a pointed side, and on the other was a blunted side. And this rod, it weighed about 13 pounds, and it was about 1.25 inches in diameter. And Phineas loved this tamping iron. He brought it with him not just to work, but basically anywhere he went. On September 3rd, 1848, so not long after Phineas's big promotion, Phineas and his explosives team were blasting through some rock that ran through a forest. And Phineas, he was right up front over the blasting site, helping them prep the explosive. His team had drilled that long, deep, skinny hole into the rock they were about to blow up, and then blasting powder was put inside, a fuse was put inside, and then Phineas took his tamping iron and began packing the powder and fuse deep into the rock. And the way he did this is he used the blunt end of his tamping iron to pack the explosives, which meant the pointed end was sticking out of the rock. And so as Phineas is doing this, someone behind him slipped on a rock. One of his men tripped or something, and so Phineas, with his hands kind of on his tamping iron, turned to the right to look and see what was going on. And when he did this, somehow his tamping iron that was inside of this skinny hole must have nudged against the inside of the rock, created a spark, and ignited the explosive inside of the rock. Which meant the tamping iron was basically fired like a missile out of this hole into Phineas's head. It went in his cheek, up behind his left eye, up and out of his skull, and then shot 80 feet away, landing on the ground covered in Phineas's blood and brains. This happened so quickly that for a second after this thing has blown through Phineas's head, Phineas just stood there upright with his eyes wide, and then suddenly a geyser of blood began shooting out of the top of his head, and then Phineas fell backwards onto the ground. When Phineas's body hit the ground, he began having a seizure, at which point his coworkers, who were still kind of shaken up from this sudden blast, they rushed over and tried to kind of position him in a way that he wouldn't hurt himself. But I mean, they're looking at him and he's literally missing half of his head. He's covered in blood. And they're thinking, there's nothing we could do for him, but basically wait for him to die. And so all of Phineas's coworkers, who adored Phineas, just stood there very somber, watching their boss die. But eventually, Phineas stopped having a seizure, and then he opened his eyes and he looked up at his crew, and he sat up and he said, "What happened?" Now remember, half of his head has been blown out by a 13-pound, 4-foot-long metal rod that has shot through his head. And his coworkers, when they heard how clearly he was speaking and how focused his eyes were, they couldn't believe it. How in the world is this guy alive, let alone having a coherent conversation with them? And so the coworkers told Phineas, "Please lie down, we'll get you help, lie down, relax." But Phineas, who still had blood also shooting out of his head, just kind of stood up casually and walked over to the railroad cart and signaled for his crew to take him back into town. And so the crew, they're looking over at Phineas, who now is literally head to toe just red from blood. Still bleeding, but less so, and he's just sitting on the railroad cart waiting for them. And so they walk over to him and they start the slow 1-mile journey into town on this railroad cart. And the whole time, they're all kind of looking at Phineas, expecting him to die any second. But instead, Phineas is just kind of looking around with half of his head, and at some point he pulled out his logbook and carefully wrote down what time they were leaving their work site to make sure his crew was accurately paid. And then finally they reached town, and Phineas was still very much alive and looking around, acting like nothing had happened to him. And the co-workers helped him to his hotel, and Phineas just sat outside on a chair in front of his hotel, just people watching, while his crew went and got a doctor. A doctor soon arrived, and he too was completely shocked at Phineas's appearance, but even more so was Phineas's eyes. He looked at the doctor, and his eyes were totally focused, like he was all there, totally lucid, looking at the doctor, waiting for him to come over and help him out with his little injury. And when the doctor kind of timidly approached Phineas, Phineas very famously said as he sat on his chair, "Doctor, here's business enough for you." Like everyone else, the doctor fully assumed that despite Phineas's miraculous recovery from this injury, that he would soon die from this horrific wound in his head. And so the doctor moved Phineas up into the hotel, put him in a bed, and then basically made him comfortable. Now, the doctor at this point was not trying to save Phineas. He felt like there was nothing he could do to save Phineas. At this point, it was like mercy. Let's make this as pain-free as possible for Phineas as he inevitably dies from this injury. But Phineas didn't die. He would break out of it and basically be okay again. However, his personality at first, after he came out of this state of delirium, was not really the same. No longer was he this funny, smart, charming, confident leader. Instead, he was this guy who seemed to have lost all of his inhibitions and was kind of childlike. He swore all the time. He would tell people he had these crazy plans he was going to go do, but he would never follow through with them. And he would tell his nieces and nephews these wild stories about himself that were obviously made up and not even close to reality. But overall, he was okay, even though you could see his brain pulsing underneath his skin on the side of his head that had been blown off. And within a couple of years of this injury, those changes to Phineas's personality kind of faded, and he really did become old Phineas. However, there was one unique quirk to Phineas post-injury that never went away. And that was Phineas's kind of unhealthy love for the tamping iron that had blown through his head. After his injury, Phineas kind of stopped making friends, and any friends he did have, he really didn't try to keep those relationships up. He didn't get married, he didn't have kids. Instead, the tamping iron became sort of like his best friend. He took it everywhere with him, even posing at one point with the tamping iron the way you would expect a couple to pose for a photo. 12 years after his horrific injury, Phineas would develop seizures, likely from the injury, and then he would die with his beloved tamping rod right by his side. His case changed neuroscience forever by showing that an injury to the brain could affect specific personality traits. Today, Phineas's skull and his tamping rod are on display at Harvard Medical School.
City lights are fading, lost in this decay. Echoes in the night lead me far away. Whispers on.
On the morning of September 19th, 2013, a man named Mark Casey sat with his girlfriend, Lynn Spalding, in the triage area of the emergency room at San Francisco General Hospital. A nurse took Lynn's temperature and her blood pressure, while Mark tried to explain what had been going on with Lynn over the past few weeks. Lynn, who was now 57, had been dealing with this really intense stomach pain. And so she had gone to the doctor, and she had been diagnosed with a urinary tract infection, and she was given antibiotics for it. But despite taking those antibiotics, it didn't get rid of the stomach pain. And in fact, her stomach pain was only getting worse. She was losing weight, and she just seemed really frail. But despite her condition obviously getting worse every single day, over the past few weeks, Lynn had basically refused to go back to the hospital, despite Mark saying, we really gotta go, you're getting worse, we gotta have you looked at. But she just kept saying no. And then finally, when Mark noticed Lynn was now becoming somewhat despondent, like he would try to talk to her and her eyes would glaze over and she would look off into the distance like she didn't even hear him, Mark had just looked at Lynn and said, you know what? I'm taking you to the hospital. And so he put her in the car, he brought her to the hospital, and now that he was here, he had to explain what was going on because Lynn was still despondent, just kind of staring off into space and very likely having no idea what was going on. And so after Mark gave all the information to the nurse said that, okay, Lynn needs to be admitted to the hospital. And so after a short wait, an orderly came over and pushed Lynn's wheelchair up to the 5th floor where she'd be staying, and Mark went with them. And then once in the room, Mark helped Lynn get settled in her bed. And again, Lynn is just kind of staring off into space, not really paying attention. And then a whole team of nurses and doctors came in and hooked Lynn up to IVs and different machines to make sure they could monitor her. And then at some point, one of the doctors pulled Mark aside and said, we think Lynn is dealing with some kind of infection. And so what we need to do is run some tests to figure out what this infection is. And then hopefully we can treat it. And so Mark said, okay, that sounds great. And then all day, Mark sat right next to Lynn and held her hand as the medical team came in and out of the room running all these tests. The following day, the medical team still didn't know what was wrong with Lynn. The tests they had run so far were inconclusive or were negative. Now, the biggest issue with Lynn was not trying to figure out what infection she had or how to cure her. Instead, it was, how do we keep Lynn in her hospital room? Because on this second day that Lynn was at the hospital, despite being very despondent still, any chance she got, she was getting out of her bed and trying to escape her room. And so the medical team, they kept having to go find her and bring her back to her room. And they tried to explain to her, like, Lynn, you're sick. That's why you're here. You need to stay in your room. But Lynn clearly was just not getting it. She was just not there. And she would just say to the team, I want to go home. I just want to go home. I want to go home. And they would say, well, Lynn, you got to get better first, and then you can go home. Now, Mark, like the medical staff, was also concerned about Lynn's behavior. It was not safe for her to get up and flee her hospital room. But Mark kind of secretly thought, maybe this is a good sign, because the day before, Lynn couldn't even walk on her own. And now today, she's walking around on her own, trying to escape the hospital, which is bad. But, she's ambulatory. That's going to be a good sign. And also, Mark was thinking that because Lynn was fleeing her room over and over again, she's going to get even better medical care because the staff has to be super focused on her. And so Mark was feeling kind of optimistic that Lynn was on the road to recovery. The next morning, so now Lynn has been at the hospital for 2 days at this point, a nurse went into Lynn's room to check on her at about 10:15 a.m. And she walked up to Lynn, who was in her bed, and Lynn immediately told the nurse that she wanted to go home. And the nurse said, sorry, Lynn, we still don't know what's wrong with you. You got to stay here for now. But again, it was pretty clear Lynn did not understand what the nurse was saying. And so Lynn was not agitated. She was laying in bed and did not appear to, want to flee the room anytime soon. And so the nurse took Lynn's vitals. They were all basically normal. And then the nurse wrote down on Lynn's chart that her condition as of this moment was fair. And then the nurse left the room. And once this nurse was gone, Lynn laid in bed for a second. And then when nobody else came in the room, she sat up, she hopped off the bed, and she took off her hospital gown. She pulled out all the cords and wires that were on her. Then she put on her jeans, her boots, her jacket. She grabbed her purse off the table, and she walked out the door. And the second she walked out the door, she would have been in this long hallway, except her room was at the end of the hallway. So when she stepped out into that hallway, if she turned right, she would have seen a long, long stretch of hallway with other hospital rooms and lots of staff and doctors and nurses kind of walking around. But to her left, it would have been a dead end with a single blue door with a green exit sign over the top of it. And so Lynn, she steps into the hallway, she looks down the long side to the right, then she looks to the left, she sees the blue door, and she goes to the blue door, she opens it up, and she disappears inside. When the nurse came back to Lynn's room and saw she wasn't there, she reported Lynn missing. Now, remember, the hospital was well aware of the fact that Lynn had been trying to escape for the past 48 hours, and so nobody was really shocked by this. In fact, the hospital, their first move was to contact Mark, who had actually gone home the night before to get some real sleep and to take a shower. And so they contacted Mark and they said, hey, Lynn's not here. Is she with you? And Mark was like, no, I'm home. She's not here. I have not seen her. I haven't talked to her. I have no idea where she is. And so the hospital at this point began this huge search in their building, just checking the entire property for Lynn, but there was no trace of her. And so the police were contacted and they launched a search both of the hospital grounds and also of the surrounding areas, and they too could not find a trace of Lynn. It was like Lynn just vanished into thin air. That is, until October 8th, 2013, so 17 days after Lynn had strolled through that blue exit door. On that day, October 8th, a hospital maintenance worker was walking down the long hallway in the hospital, not on the 5th floor where Lynn was staying, but one floor below, so on the 4th floor. And he's walking down this long hallway in the direction of the dead end side, so the same side that Lynn was on where her room was, but again, one floor above. And the maintenance worker, he walks all the way to the end of this hallway on the 4th floor, and he arrives in front of the blue door with the green exit sign above it. Again, this is below where Lynn was, but it looks the same. And the maintenance worker, he opened up the door, and when he looked out of the 4th floor door, he just froze, because what he was looking at just seemed impossible. And then he had this urge to scream, but he knew there were all these patients and kids and doctors and stuff in the hallway behind him, and he didn't want to scare anyone. And so very quietly, he reached down and grabbed his radio, and he called for help. In order to explain what happened next, you need to look at this picture. So in this picture, on the right-hand side, you see there are two outdoor landings with people on them. The one on top is the 5th floor landing, and the one below it, with a single person on it, is the 4th floor landing. And to get onto these outdoor landings, you have to walk through those blue exit doors at the end of those hallways. These blue doors are emergency exits. And so when you go out these blue doors, once they shut, they lock automatically. But now you're out on this outdoor landing, and immediately to your right, although you can't see it in this picture, there is actually another door that leads to this enclosed stairwell that will bring you all the way to the ground floor, where there's another door that's unlocked that will bring you out to safety. And so again, you walk out one of those blue doors, you're on this landing, you can turn, open up another door, you're in the stairwell, and you can evacuate. So, in theory, if you were a person that really wanted to escape this hospital, like Lynn did, going out one of these blue door emergency exits was a great idea. It would bring you to the ground. This is a way to escape the hospital. But remember, Lynn was totally confused. Mentally, she was just not there because of whatever illness was affecting her. And so when she walked out that door, she arrived on the 5th floor landing, and the door shut behind her and it locked. And the theory is, as soon as Lynn got out there, maybe she had some second thoughts and wanted to go back into the hospital. And so she turned and she grabbed that door and tried to open it back up again, but because it locks automatically, it wouldn't open. And so Lynn did have the wherewithal to turn and see this other door that led to this enclosed stairwell, the emergency stairwell that did go to the ground floor. She could absolutely go all the way down and escape. She could do that. She went into the stairwell and she went down one floor to the 4th floor landing. And when she got there, she left the stairwell and she went to that door that would lead back into the hospital on the 4th floor. And she tried it, but of course it was locked. And then again, instead of her just going back into the stairwell and going down and escaping to safety, she, for some reason, just stayed on the 4th floor landing. Again, you got to remember that she's not all there mentally, and so she was confused, and she just stayed there on the landing, basically waiting to be rescued. But despite these huge searches of the hospital property by hospital staff and by the police, for some reason, this area, this landing on the 4th floor, was never checked. And so nobody found her. That is until October 4th. So at this point, Lynn has been outside for 13 days on this landing, and a researcher from the hospital, for whatever reason, exited out one of these emergency doors, and they began making their way downstairs. And when they passed by the 4th floor landing, they spotted Lynn on the ground on the 4th floor landing, but instead of going over to her and seeing if she was okay, this researcher just called security and said, hey, there's a patient outside on the 4th floor landing, like, come check it out. And then instead of waiting for security, the researcher just left, leaving Lynn alone, and security at the hospital, who said they were going to go check, they didn't. And so 4 more days would go by with still nobody officially finding Lynn. And then finally, on October 8th, the hospital maintenance worker opened up the blue door on the 4th floor, and he saw the 4th floor landing, that exterior landing, and he saw Lynn, and he knew she was dead. Officials were never able to determine when Lynn died, so it's not clear how long she was alive out on that landing. But it is possible she could have been alive when that researcher found her, but obviously help didn't come in time. Ultimately, Lynn's family would sue the city and the hospital, and they would be awarded $3 million. On May 28, 1986, a Florida real estate agent named Marguerite Welty walked up to the front door of this little white stucco home sitting right on the edge of Lake Placid in Florida. Marguerite pulled out a key from her pocket, she unlocked the door, opened it up, and then she turned around, and standing right in front of her were her clients, this young couple named Lois and Richard Goodman, who were thinking about buying a vacation home. And so this was one of the homes they were checking out. And so Marguerite smiled at her clients and gestured for them to come inside. The house sat at the end of a quiet, shady street lined with huge trees and other small vacation homes, and a lot of these vacation homes were perfectly manicured and beautiful, but the house they were touring today was not. It was unmaintained and overgrown, the paint was chipped and fading. It just looked bad, because the owner of this property at one time had used this house as their vacation home, but lately they had just kind of stopped coming out here, and so they really never came out to check on the property, and so it definitely had the look of an abandoned property. And now the owner didn't even know if they could fix it anymore, and so they decided they would just sell it and let somebody else deal with it. And so Marguerite led Richard and Lois into the house, and she brought them right into the carpeted living room, and the house was very musky and dark. All the windows were shut and all the blinds were drawn, and so Marguerite kind of instinctively walked over to the windows and began opening up the curtains and opening up the blinds, letting sunlight into the house. And so as this room is suddenly being lit up by the sunlight, behind her, Marguerite hears Lois and Richard start to laugh at something. And so Marguerite turned around to see what was so funny, and when she saw what Lois and Richard were laughing at, Marguerite did not think it was very funny. In fact, she thought the fact that they were laughing right now was kind of rude, especially when you considered what this couple had asked of Marguerite. They had come to Marguerite and said, hey, we want to buy a vacation home. It needs to be perfect. It needs to be on the water. It needs to have this and this and this. But we have a tiny budget. Go find us homes. And so Marguerite had really struggled to find vacation homes that were in their budget, but then she had found this diamond in the rough, this house on the coast of Lake Placid. It had 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, it had a garage, direct access to the water, it even had a boat dock. I mean, this house was perfect. Now, of course, this house had obvious downsides, like the fact that it was clearly a fixer-upper. I mean, anybody who bought this home would have to put a lot of work into just making it livable again. And then also, there was a distinct weird vibe about the property itself. Because the owner was never there, they had covered all the furniture inside of this home with white sheets, which kind of gave it a sort of haunted house vibe. And then also, there was virtually nothing of value inside of this home, because again, the owner was like never here. But for some reason, there was this super intense security system on the house. I mean, there was cameras everywhere, and the windows had metal bars over them. And so the aesthetic inside and outside this house was not a good one. But again, Marguerite felt like if they could just look past the negative stuff, this was really the perfect place for them. But now, here Marguerite's clients were, laughing away at the kind of goofy interior of this home. It's like they were being totally disrespectful both to Marguerite and frankly to the owner of this property. I mean, this is a good opportunity. What are you doing? But ultimately, Marguerite couldn't force her clients to be appreciative of this. And so she just kind of laughed along with them, but then very quickly changed the subject and told them, hey, let's go walk around the rest of the house. Make sure you see the whole place before you pass judgment. But Marguerite only had to lead Richard and Lois around the house for a couple more minutes to figure out they definitely were not in the market for this house. They could not look past the bizarre, kind of spooky almost atmosphere inside the house and how run down it was. So they were just not going to put an offer on this house, and Marguerite knew it. And so even though Marguerite was definitely frustrated, she told her clients, don't worry about it. I'll go back to the drawing board. I'll find more properties and we'll check those out. And so Marguerite led Richard and Lois out of the property. She shut and locked the door behind her, and then she and her clients left. 2 days later, on May 30th, 1986, the owner of this rundown old vacation home came by to check on the property. Basically, because they were trying to sell it, they just wanted to go up and make sure there were no obviously bad things about the property. They knew it was in rough shape, but, they're just doing a sanity check. And so they get to this property, they open up the door, and they step inside, and right away, the owner is hit with this horrible smell. Now, the owner knew it normally did not smell great inside this home, but this smell he was smelling now was just so bad. It was so pungent, he knew it was not normal. And so the owner began walking around the house trying to figure out where the smell was coming from, and at some point he found himself in the living room, and his eyes happened to land on the thing that Richard and Lois Goodman had been laughing at 2 days earlier. Except when the owner saw this thing, he didn't think it was funny at all. In fact, what he did is he instantly turned around, ran out of the house, grabbed a phone, and called 911. 4 days earlier, on May 26th, a 28-year-old man named Thomas Lopez Ruiz, who was living in this makeshift campsite down by the water near Lake Placid, he decided to leave his campsite and go into town to try to earn some money. Thomas did not have a steady job. Instead, he did odd jobs in town whenever he could to earn a few bucks. But on this day, when Thomas went into town, there was no work. So Thomas decided he would go rob one of the many vacation homes along the coastline of Lake Placid. And the home that he picked is the same vacation home that Marguerite would take the Goodmans to 2 days later. And so Thomas arrives in front of this overgrown property, and he tries the doors, and they're all locked. However, Thomas had a plan. Thomas was a pretty small guy. He was about 5 foot 2 inches tall, only weighed about 140 pounds. And so he figured he could just slip through the chimney. That's how he could break into the house. And at first it went great. He slipped in no problem. And before long, he was making his way down towards the inside of the house. But what Thomas realized as he went down the chimney is the chimney was not perfectly straight up and down. Instead, it was sort of tapered, where at the top it was wide, but the deeper you got, so the farther down you went in the chimney, the narrower the inside of the chimney got. And so when Thomas was almost all the way down the chimney, he got stuck. He could not get the rest of the way down, but where he got stuck, he couldn't grab the top of the chimney. He couldn't pull himself out. And so he is absolutely wedged, can't go down, can't go up, and making matters even worse was every time he exhaled, his chest would shrink a little bit, and that would cause him to slip a little bit farther, a little bit deeper into the chimney, and then when he would try to breathe in again, his chest would not be able to fully expand again. And so basically, every second that went by, Thomas was sinking lower and lower and lower by little bits, making it harder and harder and harder to breathe. And you got to figure that he was screaming for help, which again was causing him to breathe a bunch, causing him to sink even farther. And so it would have made breathing extremely difficult. And so Thomas is like in this absolute claustrophobic nightmare, and without outside help, he had no chance of survival. 2 days later, Marguerite Welty brought the Goodmans into that property, and she would open up the blinds, and sunlight would come into the living room, and Marguerite would hear Lois and Richard laughing at something, and she would turn around, and she would see they were pointing at the fireplace, and visible in this fireplace were 2 legs dangling down inside the chimney. They were not so far down that they were touching the ground. They were just kind of suspended in the air. And Lois and Richard, based on the way the house looked already, the kind of spooky vibe, there's white sheets over all the furniture. There are these bars on all the windows. Everything is dark and dirty and kind of gross. Like there's this haunted house vibe to this place. And they're thinking, this must be a Halloween decoration or some sort of prank. A mannequin kind of jammed up into the chimney, maybe to look like a robber breaking into your house or something, that the owner never took down. Because clearly the owner stopped taking care of this property, and so it kind of makes sense that these decorations would be left out. And so Lois and Richard are laughing at this Halloween decoration, and Marguerite, she looks at the legs too, and also thinks they're just some Halloween decoration, doesn't think anything of it. And so finally they end up leaving, and that was it. But as I'm sure you all have guessed, of course those legs were not mannequin legs. Those were Thomas's legs. And in fact, the creepiest part about this is Thomas may have been alive during the house tour. The autopsy showed he actually did not die of asphyxiation, so he didn't suffocate. He died from dehydration, which takes about 2 days, and this house tour was about 2 days in. And the day prior to the house tour, a neighbor had been outside and they thought they heard someone yelling inside of the property, but for some reason, the neighbor just didn't do anything about it. And so there's a pretty good chance Thomas was barely alive as they were touring the house. But, by the time the owner came back 2 days later and smelled that horrible smell, Thomas had passed away, and that smell was the smell of his body decomposing. Also, just to close the loop on this, it's not clear why the homeowner had that really aggressive security system with the bars on the windows. He just did.
Fell down hard, saw the dark, lost my way, heart felt stark. But the sun rising up, new day fills my cup. Yesterday, shadows crept, dreams once lost, now were kept. Picked up pieces, moved ahead, future light where I tread. Shining tomorrow, here we go, brighter than when we used to know. Through the pain we've come alive, in the glow we now survive. Once was rain, clouded skies, tears fell down from my eyes. Now they dry, warmth returns, hope within brightly burns.
On the morning of May 26, 1990, Marlene Warren was at home inside of her beautiful mansion in Florida when she heard a knock on the front door. Marlene was busy and was hoping that her adult son might go answer the door, but when she looked over to the living room where her son was, she saw he was laying down watching TV and didn't even seem to have heard the knock on the door. So Marlene sighed and just walked over to the front door herself and opened it up. And to her surprise, standing on the other side of the door was a person dressed up in a clown costume, holding flowers and balloons. Now, Marlene loved clowns, and she had recently celebrated her 40th birthday, so she figured this must be someone's birthday gift to her, and she was thrilled. But after the clown handed Marlene the flowers and balloons, there was this loud popping sound inside of Marlene's house, and then Marlene fell to the floor, blood pouring down her face.
So that's going to do it. I hope you enjoyed today's stories. If you did, be sure you check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that has hundreds more stories you can listen to right now, and many of those stories are only available on that podcast. They are not on this YouTube channel. So again, that podcast is called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available on every podcast platform. Okay, until next time, thank you so much.